that we work through with them. Yes, go ahead.
There was heavy shelling by the Ukrainian army in the town of Gorlovka in the Donetsk region on Tuesday. 3 civilians died, including an 11-year-old. Is that all right under the Minsk agreement to use heavy artillery in residential areas like that?
Well, let's take a step back and look at the situation in eastern Ukraine, because there's a whole lot more to it than this report that you've mentioned, which I'm not able to confirm and I'm not familiar with. If you look at the OSCE's reports, and the OSCE has the responsibility for monitoring under the Minsk agreements, the OSCE reports that violence continues in parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, notably in and around Shirokina, which is outside the ceasefire line on the Ukrainian side, near Mariupol, also near the Donetsk International Airport, and in Avdiivka, where shelling threatens the lives and livelihoods of thousands of workers at a coking plant. So we remain very concerned about the level of violence, including the use of mortars and heavy artilleries and tanks, all of which were supposed to have been withdrawn by the separatists and backed by Russia under the Minsk agreements. The overwhelming majority of the ceasefire violations have been conducted by combined Russian separatist forces attacking Ukrainian positions on the Ukrainian side of the line of contact, which is clearly contrary to the Minsk agreements. So we again call for a full cessation of hostilities and for full implementation of the Minsk agreements, including unrestricted and safe access for OSCE monitors so they can monitor and verify the ceasefire and the heavy weapons withdrawal.
Are you aware that the Ukrainian army has used heavy artillery in residential areas on a number of occasions in recent weeks? And how is that consistent with the Minsk agreements that everybody should abide by?
Well, as I just said, the overwhelming majority of the ceasefire violations have been conducted by the Russian and separatist forces.
The one that I heard what you said, the one that I just mentioned that happened yesterday, and then there were others, including the one on May 19th, where an army shell hit an apartment building. Are those actions consistent with the Minsk agreements?
Well, you've cited reports with which I'm unfamiliar, so I'm not going to comment on them. As I've said, our view is that the overwhelming majority of the violations are coming from the separatist and Russian side.
Can you say that the Ukrainian government is abiding by the agreement, by the Minsk agreement?
Again, as I said, the overwhelming majority of the ceasefire violations are coming from the Russian separatist
side. Are you saying that the shelling by the Ukrainian army is justified?
Look, you're citing reports with which I'm not familiar, so I'm not going to comment further on that.
How closely do you follow with what's happening in eastern Ukraine? Do you read daily reports or only what the Ukrainian government is telling you?
Look, as I've said, the OSCE plays a monitoring role on the ground, and if you look at the OSCE's reports,
they do report about those shellings.
They also report the violence that I've described, which continues on the Ukrainian side of the ceasefire lines.
If the Ukrainian government thinks that the other side is violating the agreement, and they do think that, does that make it all right for the Ukrainian government to violate it some more?
Look, our position is that we call for full implementation of the Minsk agreements, and by
everyone, right? Does that include the Ukrainian government?
And again, the primary source of violations of the Minsk agreements and the ceasefire come from the separatists and the Russian side. Yes, Matt.
Perhaps you could look into and familiarize yourself, or have someone do it with the reports that she's mentioning, and then come back to us and tell us whether or not you think that they were violations, or if they're totally in line. Yeah, I mean, in line with if both sides are implementing Minsk, but you said several times that the overwhelming majority of violations are from the separatists.
That's right.
But overwhelming majority isn't all, is it? So there are some violations by the government, the Kiev government, correct? I mean, it would stand to reason.
Well, yeah, it does stand to reason.
I mean, it might be 99% to 1%, but
I don't
there's
have
still
a percentage to affix to it, but
whatever. But it's not all the violations are happening on the separatist side, correct? Is that the administration's line?
Well, correct, but again,
so there are violations.
As I've said, it's quite clear to us where most of them are coming from.
Right, but most is not all, right?
I think I've agreed with you.
Okay.
But,
I wanted to ask you, related to this, the Vice President,
Sorry.
well, this
I'm
is
so
about
sorry.
Ukraine as well, but if it's.
Go ahead. Yeah?
May I? From what you're saying, one may think that Kiev has a completely hands-off approach in that conflict. Is that how you see it?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean
That
by
it doesn't do anything there. It's all just happening, and Kiev has nothing to do with all of that. That's what comes across from what you're saying, with overwhelming majority of violations and all of that.
That isn't what I've implied, and it's not what I've said. Again, the situation in eastern
How do
Ukraine.
you evaluate the Ukrainian government's actions at the moment? Do they abide by the agreements? Do you approve of everything that they're doing?
Look, the Ukrainian government is committed to implementing the Minsk agreements. Of course, the secretary and the vice president have been in recent contact with President Poroshenko, and so we remain
But
focused
using
on
heavy artillery in residential areas, is that implementing the Minsk agreement?
Well, again, there are withdrawal provisions in the Minsk agreements, and unfortunately, if you look at the Russian separatist side of the line, where the OSCE has been unable to verify the withdrawal of heavy weapons, it's very difficult to verify. So
you're saying their potential violations
no.
justify the Ukrainian government's violations?
Look,
Is that what you're saying?
I really don't have anything to add beyond my statement earlier, that the overwhelming number of violations are coming from the Russian and separatist side in eastern Ukraine. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the Vice